Imagine this. It is the morning of June the 17th, 1775, and the British Army wakes up to something impossible. Across the water from Boston, on the Charlestown Peninsula, a new rebel fort has appeared overnight. Not a rumor. Not a scattered line of frightened farmers. Not a few men hiding behind stone walls. A real earthwork. A redoubt. A rough square of dirt and muscle dug into the top of a hill by men who had no right in British eyes to build anything that bold. The British officers stare across the harbor and understand immediately what it means. If the rebels hold those heights, they can threaten Boston. They can aim cannon toward the city. They can make the British position feel smaller, tighter, more vulnerable. They can turn the siege from an embarrassment into a trap. This cannot be allowed. Boston is the center of British power in Massachusetts. It is the one place where the King's army is supposed to feel secure. British regulars hold the city. British ships control the harbor. British guns can bombard the shoreline. British officers can look out from their headquarters and tell themselves that the rebellion is still something they can crush. But now, before sunrise, there is a rebel fort staring back at them. Built in one night. Promontories. On ground the British thought they could take whenever they wished. And that is the insult that makes the battle inevitable. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, cannot ignore it. General William Howe cannot ignore it. The Royal Navy cannot ignore it. The King's army has to respond. So the British prepare to do what professional armies are trained to do. They will land troops. They will march up the hill. They will drive the rebels out. They will show the colonies that farmers with muskets cannot stand against British regulars in the open field. By nightfall, the British will technically win. They will take the ground. They will plant their flag. They will force the Americans to retreat. But the cost will be so horrifying that the word victory will never sound the same again. Because this is not the story of how Britain lost the hill. It is the story of how Britain won it. And still walked away shaken. To understand why this battle mattered so much, you have to understand what Boston looked like before the first shot was fired on Breed's Hill. The war had begun only 2 months earlier, in April of 1775. British troops marched out of Boston toward Lexington and Concord to seize colonial military supplies. They expected a show of force. They expected resistance to scatter. They expected armed locals to make noise, then go home. That is not what happened. At Lexington, men died. At Concord, the militia fought back. And on the long British retreat to Boston, the road turned into a nightmare. Colonial militia fired from behind walls, trees, houses, and fields. British soldiers who had marched out in confidence came back exhausted, bleeding, angry, and stunned. The rebellion had become real. Almost overnight, thousands of militia poured into the countryside around Boston. They came from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and beyond. They were not one professional army. They were a collection of town militias, volunteer companies, local commanders, farmers, artisans, laborers, and men who had brought their own muskets from home. They were badly organized. They were short on supplies. They lacked artillery. Many of them had no formal military training, but they had numbers. And they had Boston surrounded. The British were trapped in the city. That was the humiliating truth. The most powerful empire in the world had soldiers in Boston, ships in the harbor, generals in fine uniforms, and guns that could smash buildings apart. But outside the city, the roads belonged to the rebels. The countryside belonged to the rebels. The hills belonged to the rebels, if they could get there first. And that was the danger. Boston is a city defined by water and high ground. Whoever controls the hills around it can threaten the harbor and the town. If colonial forces put heavy guns on the heights, the British position becomes much harder to hold. British commanders understood this. Colonial leaders understood it too. So in June, when the rebels learned that the British might move to occupy the hills of Charlestown or Dorchester, they made a decision that was either brilliant, reckless, or both. They would get there first. On the night of June the 16th, roughly 1,200 colonial troops marched quietly from Cambridge toward Charlestown. Their commander was Colonel William Prescott. Prescott was not a polished aristocrat general. He was a Massachusetts man, tall, tough, experienced, and calm enough to keep frightened soldiers working in the dark. He had fought before, he knew men, and that night his task was almost insane. March onto a peninsula exposed to British naval power. Occupy high ground visible from Boston. Build a fortification before daylight. And somehow avoid being destroyed before the sun came up. The original target was Bunker Hill. But in the darkness, confusion, disagreement, and urgency of the mission, the main fortification was built farther forward on Breed's Hill. That mistake, if it was a mistake, made everything more dangerous. Breed's Hill was closer to Boston. That meant the redoubt was more threatening to the British. But it also meant the men inside it were more exposed. They were closer to British guns, closer to British attack, closer to the water, closer to being trapped. All night, the colonials dug. They did not have enough tools. They did not have enough engineers. They did not have enough time. But they had shovels, picks, muscle, fear, and the knowledge that sunrise would reveal everything. The men worked in silence as best they could. Dirt came up from the hill. Earth walls began to rise. A redoubt took shape. Behind them was the narrow Charlestown Neck, the dangerous strip of land connecting the peninsula to the mainland. If British ships shelled that neck, retreat could become deadly. If British troops landed behind them, they could be trapped. If the redoubt failed, there would be nowhere easy to run. But by dawn, the impossible had happened. The British woke up and saw a rebel fort on the hill. One British observer could hardly believe what he was looking at. An earthwork had appeared in the night, like something conjured out of darkness. For the Americans inside the fort, dawn must have felt like exposure itself. The darkness that had protected them was gone. Now they could see Boston, and Boston could see them. British ships began firing. Cannonballs tore into the hill. The earth shook. Men who had been digging all night now crouched behind fresh dirt while heavy shots screamed overhead or slammed into the ground around them. They were exhausted before the battle even started. Many had not slept. Many had not eaten properly. Some had marched through the night, dug for hours, and now had to wait under bombardment for the full weight of the British Army to come across the water. Waiting may have been the worst part. A man can endure action because action gives fear somewhere to go. But waiting under cannon fire is different. You hear the guns. You see the smoke. You feel the impact. You know the real attack has not even begun. And you have time to think. Time to think about your ammunition. Time to think about your family. Time to think about the fact that the men coming for you are not a mob. They are British regulars, professional soldiers, the same army that had fought across Europe and the Empire. The same army whose bayonets had broken enemies far better trained than the men waiting in that redoubt. For the British, the plan looked simple. Land troops at the base of the peninsula. Form lines. Advance uphill. Drive the rebels from the works. Take the position. End the embarrassment. General William Howe would lead the main assault. Howe was brave, experienced, and personally courageous. He was not a coward hiding behind others. When British troops attacked, he was willing to be near the danger. His men respected that. But Howe also made a choice that would define the battle. Instead of simply surrounding the rebels, instead of waiting, instead of using a slower approach, instead of letting hunger, heat, and naval power wear the Americans down, the British would assault directly. There were reasons for this. The British needed to act quickly. They wanted to restore authority. They believed rebel troops could not withstand a disciplined bayonet attack. They believed the sight of British regulars marching uphill in formation would be enough to break militia courage. And to be fair, that belief was not irrational. Most European officers looking at the situation would have assumed the same thing. An amateur force in a rough earthwork, short on ammunition, exhausted from digging, facing trained regulars with bayonets and artillery support. The outcome should have been obvious. The rebels might fire once or twice, then they would run. That was the assumption. It was wrong. As the British prepared, the battlefield became a theater of terror. Charlestown itself was set on fire. The town burned as smoke rolled across the peninsula. Flames climbed through houses and wharves. Black smoke drifted over the water. Cannon thundered from British ships. The air filled with heat, ash, confusion, and noise. Across the harbor, civilians watched. From Boston, from rooftops, from nearby hills, from distant farms, people stared at the smoke and tried to understand what was happening. One of them was Abigail Adams, watching from a distance with her young son, John Quincy. They could hear the cannon, they could see the smoke, they could feel that something enormous was taking place, even if no one yet knew how many men would die before the day ended. Inside the American lines, Prescott moved among his men. This mattered. A commander in a moment like this does not only issue orders, he becomes the measure of fear. If he looks terrified, men feel permission to panic. If he looks steady, men borrow steadiness from him. Prescott understood that his men were not professional soldiers. They could not waste ammunition. They could not win a long firefight. They did not have endless powder and shot. Every musket ball had to count. So the order became discipline itself. Hold fire. Wait. Do not shoot too early. Let the British come close. The exact wording that history remembers may not be perfectly certain, but the meaning is clear. Do not fire until you can make the shot matter. That order was both tactical and psychological. It forced frightened men to do the hardest thing possible. Watch the enemy approach. Do nothing. Let redcoats climb the hill. Do nothing. See bayonets flashing. Do nothing. Hear drums and shouted orders. Do nothing. Feel your body begging to fire. Still do nothing. Because if the Americans fired too early, the smoke would blind them, the balls would fall short, and the British line would keep coming. But if they waited, if they held their nerve, if they allowed the British to come close enough, then one volley could tear into the attackers like a wall of iron. That was the only chance. The British began the first assault. Try to picture it from the hill. Lines of red coats forming below, officers with swords, drummers beating, flags moving, bayonets fixed. The British did not move like a mob. They moved like an empire, step by step, formation by formation, climbing toward men they believed would break. The Americans watched from behind earthworks, fences, walls, and rough defensive lines. Their fingers tightened on triggers. Their mouths went dry. Their shoulders ached. Their eyes watered from smoke. Still they waited. The British climbed closer. Still they waited. Closer. Still they waited. Then the Americans fired. The first volley was devastating. At close range, musket fire does not look like the clean, distant smoke of a painting. It is brutal. It is loud, uneven, and immediate. Men are hit in the face, chest, stomach, arms and legs. Officers fall. Lines stagger. Soldiers trip over the men in front of them. The air fills with screams and powder smoke. The British line was torn apart. These were not imaginary soldiers. They were real men from real regiments. Light infantry, grenadiers, regulars who had trained for war, men who had marched up that hill expecting militia to run. Instead, they walked into a storm. The British attack faltered. Then it broke. The first assault was thrown back. For the Americans, it must have been almost unbelievable. They had done it. They had waited. They had fired. They had stopped the King's army. But the battle was not over. The British were shocked, but not defeated. Professional armies do not always collapse after one repulse. British officers reformed their men. Orders were shouted. Wounded soldiers were dragged back. Units tried to reorganize. Under fire, smoke, and confusion. How prepared to attack again? This is where the battle became a test of will. One failed assault could be explained. Bad timing. Bad ground. unexpected resistance. But a second assault would prove whether the first was luck or something worse. The British came again. They advanced through smoke, heat, and the bodies of men from the first attack. Imagine the psychology of that second climb. The soldiers now knew what waited for them. They had seen comrades fall. They had heard the rebel volley. They had watched the hill erupt. And still they had to go forward. That is the terrible machinery of 18th century warfare. Discipline does not ask whether a man is afraid. It orders him to walk anyway. So they walked. Again the Americans held fire. Again they waited. Again the British came close. And again the hill exploded. The second volley was another disaster. British bodies fell across the slope. Officers went down in shocking numbers. The attack collapsed again. For a second time, militia and provincial troops had stopped British regulars in a direct assault. This should have changed everything. At this point, any careful commander might have stopped. The Americans were short on ammunition. They were tired. They were trapped in a position that could be surrounded. British ships still controlled the water. British artillery could continue pounding the hill. Time was not necessarily on the American side. But Howe attacked again. A third assault was prepared. And this time, the British changed their approach. They concentrated more directly on the redoubt. They simplified the attack. They would not repeat the same mistake in quite the same way. They would push hard against the main position, and force the issue. Inside the redoubt, the Americans faced the nightmare every defender fears. They were running out of ammunition. This is the detail that turns courage into tragedy. The men had done everything asked of them. They had marched in the dark. They had dug through the night. They had endured cannon fire. They had held their fire. They had repelled the British once. They had repelled them twice. But bravery does not create powder. A musket without ammunition becomes a club. A redoubt without ammunition becomes a grave. As the British formed for the third attack, the Americans knew they could not produce another storm like the first two. They could fire what they had. Then the bayonets would come. And most of the Americans did not have bayonets. That mattered enormously. In the 18th century, a bayonet charge was not symbolic. It was a terrifying close combat weapon. British soldiers trained to use it. They understood that once the firing stopped and the lines closed, the bayonet could decide the fight. Many colonial soldiers had muskets, but not bayonets. They could shoot, they could reload, they could fight from cover. But if British regulars got into the redoubt with steel, the defenders would be in terrible danger. The third British assault came forward. This time, the American fire was weaker. Still deadly in places. Still courageous, but not enough. The British reached the redoubt. Then the battle became close, violent, and chaotic. No longer lines on a map. No longer distant smoke. Men fought over dirt walls. Muskets became clubs. Stones were thrown. Bodies crashed together. Bayonets thrust into the redoubt. The British poured in. The defenders began to break away. Some fought as they retreated. Some ran. Some were cut down. Some escaped across the dangerous neck under fire. The British finally took the hill. They had won. On paper, the result was clear. The British captured the position. The Americans withdrew. The redoubt fell. Breed's Hill belonged to the King's army. But anyone standing on that hill after the fighting ended could see the truth. This was not the victory Britain had expected. The slope was covered with British dead and wounded. The officer corps had been savaged. Elite troops had been shattered. The price of taking one rough American earthwork was over 1,000 British casualties. Over 1,000. For a single hill. For a position built overnight. Against men the British had been told were not a real army. The Americans lost heavily too, around 450 killed, wounded, and captured. And one of those losses would become symbolic, far beyond the battlefield. Dr. Joseph Warren was dead. Warren was one of the most important Patriot leaders in Massachusetts. He was a physician, a political organizer, a man deeply involved in the revolutionary cause. He had recently been appointed a major general, but at Bunker Hill he did not command like a general standing safely behind the line. He volunteered to fight in the redoubt. He went into the danger. And near the end of the battle, as the British stormed the position, Warren was killed. His death gave the American cause something every revolution understands whether it wants to or not. A martyr. A man whose body could become a symbol. Warren's death told the colonies that this was no longer a protest. No longer a dispute about taxes. No longer just angry pamphlets, meetings, petitions, boycotts, and speeches. Men of status were dying in battle. Leaders were dying with muskets in their hands. The conflict had crossed a line, and Britain had helped push it there. That is one of the great ironies of Bunker Hill. The British took the ground, but the battle hardened the rebellion. Before Bunker Hill, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. Many did not yet think in terms of independence. They were angry, they resisted Parliament, they feared tyranny, but full separation from Britain was still a radical idea for many people. Bunker Hill changed the emotional temperature. It proved the British would use massive force. It proved the Americans could stand against that force. It proved that the conflict would not end with a quick show of imperial power. And it proved something even more dangerous for Britain. The rebels were willing to die in formation. That was not supposed to happen. British assumptions about the Americans had been built on contempt. They imagined the colonists as disorderly, undisciplined, cowardly when faced with regular troops. Good perhaps at skirmishing from behind walls, but not at standing in a serious fight. Bunker Hill damaged that belief. Not completely. Not forever. British officers would continue to underestimate American forces at times. But after June the 17th, they could no longer pretend that the rebels would always run. The Americans had stood on a hill under bombardment. They had waited until the British came close. They had shattered 2 assaults. They had only been driven out when ammunition failed and bayonets reached the works. That is not the behavior of men who are merely pretending to be soldiers. And the British knew it. Some officers understood immediately that this kind of victory was dangerous, because an empire can survive losing men, but it cannot easily survive learning that every future victory may cost that much. If every rebel position had to be taken at that price, then the war would not be a police action. It would be a bloodbath. That realization mattered. Bunker Hill did not end the siege of Boston. It did not destroy the British Army. It did not give the Americans control of the city. It did not produce independence, but it changed the mental battlefield. For the Americans, it was proof. Proof that they could fight. Proof that British regulars were not invincible. Proof that courage, terrain, preparation, and discipline could make up for many weaknesses. For the British, it was a warning that the rebellion was deeper than they thought. A warning that frontal assaults against determined defenders could be ruinous. A warning that the war in America would not be won by confidence alone. And this is why the battle sits in such a strange place in history. The British won the tactical fight, but the Americans won something harder to measure. They won belief. And belief is one of the most dangerous things a rebellion can possess. Before Bunker Hill, the colonial army around Boston was not really an army. It was a gathering of armed men under local commands, with uncertain enlistments, uneven discipline, and no single national structure. It could have dissolved. It could have lost confidence. It could have become another burst of anger that faded after the first terrifying confrontation. But after Bunker Hill, the men around Boston could tell themselves a new story. We stood. We made them bleed. We did not run until the powder was gone. They took the hill, but they paid for every foot of it. That story mattered. It traveled through camps. It traveled through towns. It traveled to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And at almost the same moment, another decision was reshaping the war. George Washington had been chosen to command the Continental Army. He had not yet arrived at Boston when the battle was fought, but Bunker Hill was the kind of battle that revealed what he was about to inherit. He was not taking command of a defeated rabble. He was taking command of men who had already proven they would fight, but he was also taking command of chaos. Courage without organization. Bravery without enough powder. Local spirit without national discipline. A siege without a professional army. Bunker Hill showed both the promise and the danger of the American cause. These men could stand, but standing alone would not be enough. They needed command. They needed supply. They needed artillery. They needed training. They needed a war effort that could turn local resistance into a national army. Washington would spend the rest of the war trying to solve that problem. But on June the 17th, before Washington even reached Cambridge, the men on Breed's Hill had already taught Britain a lesson. They had shown that the rebellion could not be dismissed. And that may be why the battle's name survived so powerfully. Even though most of the fighting happened on Breed's Hill, the world remembers Bunker Hill. The name is almost mythic. Bunker Hill. It sounds like a place where a country discovers what kind of war it is in. And in many ways, that is exactly what happened. The British discovered that the rebellion was not going to be cheap. The Americans discovered that British regulars could be hurt. The colonies discovered that blood would be required. And the war discovered its first great symbol. But symbols can hide the ugliness. So it is worth slowing down and looking at what the men actually experienced. For the British soldier climbing that hill, the battle was not a lesson in imperial policy. It was heat, smoke, sweat, fear, heavy gear, orders shouted through chaos, a slope that seemed to get longer with every step, a wall of dirt ahead, and then the sudden crack of American muskets at close range. Men he knew falling beside him, officers disappearing, drums drowned by screams, the first assault broken, then being ordered to do it again. For the American defender, the battle was not an abstract beginning of national identity. It was exhaustion, thirst, a dry mouth, a musket barrel growing hot, a pouch with too few cartridges, the discipline to wait, the shock of seeing red-coated bodies fall, the terror of seeing them come again, the knowledge that the ammunition was going down, the realization that courage might not be enough once the bayonets reached the wall. History turns battles into arrows and blocks. Real men experience them as confusion. This is why Bunker Hill deserves more than a simple sentence. British victory. That is true, but it is not enough. If all you know is that Britain won, you miss the entire meaning of the battle. Because the question is not only who held the hill at sunset, the question is what the hill cost, and what the cost revealed. The British took the ground, but they lost the illusion of an easy war. The Americans lost the ground, but they gained proof that resistance could survive open battle. That exchange mattered more than the dirt itself. In a conventional military report, the British had achieved the objective. But wars are not fought only in reports. They are fought in morale, in expectations, in political will, in what soldiers believe about the next battle, in what civilians believe about the cause, in what governments believe the war will cost. Bunker Hill changed all of that. News of the battle traveled across the colonies. It did not sound like humiliation. It sounded like defiance. The British had attacked 3 times. The Americans had thrown them back twice. The defenders had run out of ammunition. The British had lost a staggering number of men. That was the story people remembered. And stories shape wars. In Britain, the news was more troubling. The government could still call it a victory. The generals could still report that the rebels had been driven from the field. The king's forces still held Boston. But the casualty lists told a darker story. Too many officers. Too many elite troops. Too much blood for one hill. And if the rebels could do this in Massachusetts, what would happen if the rebellion spread? What would happen if every colony produced men willing to dig in and fight? What would happen if the war required not one expedition, but years of campaigning across forests, farms, rivers, towns, and coastlines? This was the nightmare Bunker Hill hinted at. A continent cannot be subdued like a single battlefield. And America was not a small battlefield. The British Army could win fights, but could it win enough of them, at acceptable cost, across such distance? That question would haunt the Empire for the rest of the war. Bunker Hill also exposed a problem in British command culture. The British Army was brave. No one can seriously look at those assaults and deny British courage. The men who climbed that hill were not cowards. They walked into fire again and again. The officers who led them were not hiding. Many paid with their lives. But courage at the tactical level could not fix strategic misunderstanding. The British had courage. They had discipline. They had bayonets. They had ships. They had artillery. But they did not yet fully understand the nature of the war they were entering. They thought they were suppressing rebellion. They were actually helping create a revolution. Every harsh measure pushed more colonists toward resistance. Every bloody clash made compromise harder. Every victory won at excessive cost made the Empire look less invincible. Bunker Hill was one of the first moments when the British won in a way that made their larger problem worse. That is the central contradiction of the battle. They succeeded, and their success revealed danger. The hill was taken, and the war became more serious. The rebels were driven off, and the rebellion became more believable. The King's army proved it could still advance under fire, and the colonists proved they could make that advance unbearable. That is why Bunker Hill belongs perfectly in a series about how America outflanked Britain. Because outflanking is not always physical. Sometimes you outflank an enemy by changing the meaning of the fight. Pri 10. Britain wanted the battle to mean obedience restored. America made it mean resistance proven. Britain wanted to show that regular troops could crush colonial defiance. America showed that colonial defiance could bleed regular troops white. Britain wanted a demonstration of power. America turned it into a demonstration of cost. And cost can be deadly. Empires do not only ask, can we win? They ask whether openly or not, how many times can we afford to win like this? Bunker Hill gave Britain a frightening answer. Not many. There is a line often associated with the aftermath of the battle. The idea that a few more victories like this would ruin British dominion in America. Whether phrased in different ways by different men, the meaning was obvious to anyone looking at the casualty lists. A victory that destroys too much of the victor is not a normal victory. It is a warning disguised as success. That is what Britain carried away from Bunker Hill. A warning, and that warning changed the way the war felt. For General Gage, the battle damaged his authority. He had already struggled to contain the rebellion after Lexington and Concord, now under his command. The British had taken a hill, but at a horrifying price. Confidence in him declined. Eventually he would be replaced. For General Howe, Bunker Hill was both proof of bravery and a shadow over future decisions. He had seen what frontal assaults against determined Americans could cost. Later in the war, Howe would often be criticized for being too cautious when opportunities appeared. Some historians have looked back at Bunker Hill and wondered how much that hill stayed with him. How could it not? If you personally watch elite troops torn apart climbing a slope against men you had been told would not stand, you do not forget it. A general may continue to fight. He may win battles. He may make bold moves. But somewhere in his mind Bunker Hill remains. The hill where victory bled too much. For the Americans, the battle also left scars. They had not won the field. They had lost men. They had lost Joseph Warren. They had been forced to retreat. They had learned that courage without ammunition becomes disaster. They had learned that fixed positions can become traps. They had learned that British bayonets were terrifying once they reached the works. But their scars hardened them rather than breaking them. The men who survived could say they had faced the regulars. They had not imagined the Empire's power. They had seen it, and they had made it pay. That kind of memory builds armies. Not professional armies by itself, but the emotional foundation of an army. The belief that training and supply might turn courage into victory. The belief that if they could do this once, Badly prepared, exhausted, short on ammunition, then perhaps with better leadership they could do more. That belief mattered when Washington arrived. It mattered during the siege of Boston. It mattered when Henry Knox later dragged cannon from Fort Ticonderoga across winter roads to give Washington the artillery he needed. It mattered when the British finally evacuated Boston in 1776 after American guns were placed on Dorchester Heights. Bunker Hill did not drive the British out immediately, but it was part of the chain of events that made the British position in Boston feel increasingly unsustainable. The battle also helped create an American memory of sacrifice. Joseph Warren became central to that memory. He had been a doctor, a political leader, and a symbol of commitment. He could have remained behind the lines. He could have preserved himself for leadership. Instead, he entered the redoubt as a volunteer and died in the fighting. That mattered because revolutions need proof that leaders are not merely sending other men to die. Warren's death gave the cause that proof. It was tragic. It was politically powerful. And it helped turn Bunker Hill into more than a military event. It became a story of sacrifice. But it is also important not to turn every part of the battle into legend. The Americans were brave but not perfect. There was confusion in command. There were disputes about who was in charge. There were problems reinforcing the position. There were failures in supply. There was the questionable decision to fortify Breed's Hill instead of Bunker Hill. There was the inability to bring enough ammunition. There were men who did not reach the front. There were units that performed better than others. This was not a clean, heroic painting. It was messy, improvised, and dangerous. But that messiness is exactly what makes the battle feel so American in the revolutionary sense. It was not a perfect army executing a perfect plan. It was an improvised force of colonists building something overnight, making tactical mistakes, and still shocking the most professional army in the world. That is the real power of the story. Improvisation did not make them invincible, but it made them unpredictable. And the British hated unpredictability. Empires prefer clear categories: soldiers, civilians, armies, mobs, rebels, subjects. But the Americans kept blurring the lines. A farmer could become a soldier. A hill could become a fortress overnight. A town meeting could become a war council. A retreat could become a legend. A defeat could become proof. Bunker Hill was one of the first great examples of that. The British looked at the battlefield and saw a tactical victory. The Americans looked at the same battlefield and saw evidence that the empire could be resisted. Both were right. But only one interpretation helped the rebellion grow. That is why the battle's emotional result mattered so much. A rebellion can survive defeat if the defeat teaches people they are stronger than they thought. A government can suffer victory if the victory teaches it the enemy is stronger than expected. Bunker Hill did both. It made Americans more confident. It made British commanders more cautious. That is an extraordinary outcome for a battle in which the British held the ground. And the more you study it, the more the title becomes clear. This was the battle Britain won, and still lost. Not lost in the narrow military sense. The British captured the hill. That must be stated clearly. But they lost the easy story. They lost the idea that colonial resistance would collapse in open battle. They lost hundreds of irreplaceable trained soldiers and officers. They lost the psychological advantage of assumed invincibility. They lost the chance to make the war feel small. And they helped create the opposite of what they wanted: a rebel myth of courage under fire. Now imagine being a British officer after the battle. You survived. You are standing on the hill. The smoke is drifting away. Charlestown is burned. The redoubt is yours. The rebels are gone. You should feel triumph. But around you are the bodies of men you knew. Officers, friends, veterans, elite troops. Men who had marched uphill because they believed the enemy would break. And now the hill is silent, except for the wounded. What exactly have you won? A patch of earth. A burned town. A lesson you did not want. That is the mood Bunker Hill left behind. not celebration. Shock. For the Americans retreating from the hill, the emotions were different, but just as complicated. They had lost the position. They had seen friends killed. They had watched Joseph Warren fall. They had run out of ammunition. They had retreated under danger. But they also knew what they had done. They had stood. They had fired into the Empire's best troops. They had watched the first attack fail. They had watched the second attack fail. They had made Britain pay a terrible price for the third. They had lost the ground, but they had not lost their nerve. And sometimes, early in a war, nerve matters more than ground. Because ground can be retaken. Confidence, once destroyed, is much harder to rebuild. The Americans left Bunker Hill with confidence damaged by grief but strengthened by proof. The British left Bunker Hill with ground gained but confidence wounded by cost. That is why the battle became one of the defining moments of the early revolution. It taught both sides that this war would not be what they expected. The British expected submission. They found resistance. The Americans feared British invincibility. They found British blood. No one could go back to the world before June the 17th. The hill had changed too much. In the weeks and months after the battle, Boston remained under siege. The armies watched each other. Washington arrived and took command. The colonial forces slowly became something more like an army. The British remain in the city, powerful but constrained. The war widened. The politics hardened. Independence, still not declared in 1775, became more imaginable, not inevitable. Nothing was inevitable, but more imaginable. That is the real historical function of battles like Bunker Hill. They do not decide everything by themselves. Instead, they make certain futures more possible. Before Bunker Hill, it was possible to think the rebellion might collapse under British pressure. After Bunker Hill, it was possible to think the rebellion might survive. Before Bunker Hill, British commanders could imagine that colonial troops would not endure a serious assault. After Bunker Hill, they knew better. Before Bunker Hill, many colonists could still imagine the conflict as a temporary crisis. After Bunker Hill, the bodies made that harder. The battle narrowed the path to compromise. Blood does that. Once men have died in large numbers, politics changes. Every casualty becomes an argument. Every grave becomes a demand. Every family that loses someone has a reason to ask what the death was for. That question is dangerous for an empire. Because if the answer becomes liberty, then the empire has a problem bayonets cannot easily solve. Joseph Warren's death sharpened that question. So did the deaths of ordinary men whose names never became famous. Farmers, laborers, tradesmen, young men, old veterans. Men who had walked to a hill because their towns, their politics, their anger, their fear, or their sense of duty brought them there. Bunker Hill was not fought by marble statues. It was fought by humans, and the meaning of the battle came from what those humans endured. This is why the battlefield itself still has power. Today, people see the monument and the name. They may know the phrase. They may know the myth. Kami. But beneath the monument is the memory of a hastily built earthwork, a ditch, musket balls, smoke, and men waiting for an army to climb toward them. The physical ground matters because the battle was about ground. A hill, a redoubt, a peninsula, a line of retreat, a city across the water. But the meaning of that ground became much bigger than the ground itself. Breed's Hill was not valuable because it was magical. It was valuable because of what it forced both sides to reveal. The British revealed they were willing to pay blood to preserve authority. The Americans revealed they were willing to stand and make that authority pay. That exchange is the beginning of real war. Not a riot, not a protest, not a raid, a war. And that is why many historians treat Bunker Hill as one of the true beginnings of the American Revolutionary War in the military sense. Lexington and Concord lit the fuse. Bunker Hill showed how big the explosion might become. It was the first time large forces fought over a position in a sustained battle. It was the first time the British saw, in one terrible afternoon, that victory in America might demand far more than punishment. It would demand conquest. And conquest of determined people over vast territory is one of the hardest things an army can attempt. The British could take hills. They could burn towns. They could win battles. But could they make Americans stop believing they had a chance? Bunker Hill suggested the answer might be no. That is why this story still matters. It is not just about musket smoke and redcoats. It is about the gap between winning a battle and winning a war. Those are not the same thing. A battle is a moment. A war is a system of moments connected by morale, logistics, politics, memory, and will. Bunker Hill was a British victory inside an American story of growing resistance. It was a tactical success that became a strategic warning. It was a hill taken by force and transformed by memory. And in that sense, Britain did not simply fight the men in the redoubt. Britain fought the meaning those men would leave behind. That was a much harder enemy. Because you can drive men from a hill. You cannot easily drive courage out of a population once it has seen the empire bleed. This is the lesson Britain learned too late. At Bunker Hill, the Americans did not need to win in the ordinary way to gain something valuable. They needed to prove they could stand. They did. They needed to prove British regulars could be hurt. They did. They needed to prove the war would be costly. They did. They needed to give the colonies a story of defiance. They did. The British needed to crush confidence. They failed. And that is why the hill belongs to both victory and defeat at the same time. On the map, Britain won. In the mind of the rebellion, America did not lose. That contradiction is the whole battle. And it is the kind of contradiction that changes history. So when people remember Bunker Hill, they often remember the wrong simplicity. They say the British won. Or they say the Americans proved themselves. Both are true. Neither is complete. The real story is that both sides learned something they could never unlearn. Britain learned that America would be expensive to subdue. America learned that Britain could be resisted. Once those two lessons existed, the war became something larger than anyone had expected. A siege became a revolution. A rebellion became an army. A hill became a symbol. And a British victory became one of the most dangerous victories the empire ever won. That is why the title matters. The battle Britain won, and still lost. Because sometimes victory is not measured by who owns the ground at sunset. Sometimes it is measured by who can afford the cost. Sometimes it is measured by who walks away more determined. Sometimes it is measured by what the survivors believe the next morning. And on the morning after Bunker Hill, the British still had the hill. But the Americans had something they did not have before. Proof. Proof that ordinary men could face the empire. Proof that preparation and nerve could stop professional troops. Proof that the revolution might survive open battle. Proof that Britain could win and still be wounded. That proof would matter for the rest of the war. It would echo through the siege of Boston. It would follow Washington when he took command. It would sit behind every British calculation about how hard to push and how much blood to spend. It would become part of the American memory of resistance. And it began with men digging in the dark. A redoubt appearing before dawn. A British army deciding that the insult could not stand. 2 assaults thrown back. A 3rd assault finally breaking through. A hill taken. A town burned. A leader killed. An empire bloodied. And a rebellion, instead of being crushed, learning that it could fight. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe, because this channel is about the hidden decisions, impossible gambles, military deception, and battlefield moments that changed history. And I want to hear your take in the comments. Was Bunker Hill truly a British victory? Or was it one of those rare battles where the side that retreated gained more than the side that held the field? Drop your thoughts below, and tell me which costly victory in history you think deserves its own episode. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing an army can do is win a battle it cannot afford. And at Bunker Hill, Britain learned that lesson in blood.